I want to talk about the UK government's 21st century theocracy in the light of insights from relationship with Africa. I want to make a basic, simple suggestion. The UK government is theocratic. It was striking to me recently that a Christian author, a German lady as it happens, could speak very strongly against theocracy. Then another author, Gunaike, a Nigerian, points out that mankind has, in the West, usurped the role of God. Following Ogunaike, the UK surely is a theocracy, in which man equals Theo. Key, of course, to whether the UK is a theocracy is how one defines Theo, i.e. God. Who is God, What is God? What's he like? What kinds of things does he do? And so on. These kind of characteristics of God are much discussed and argued by mankind through history. That is to say, they're not set like an eternal stone. There's no such stone, There's no way of clearly knowing exactly who God is, except that when God reveals himself. So given the, in absolute terms, almost infinite possibilities as to God's nature and character, on what basis can we claim to know that the UK is not a theocracy? Is a question I'm asking. I want to look at the above raised issues with respect to the relationship between the UK and Africa. Much of Africa, sometimes known as Anglophone Africa, makes a lot of use of English, especially that is for formal and official purposes. There has, to my knowledge, been no formal condemnation of this practice. It's approved. It's not only approved, it's considered legitimate. As a result, what we could call African deities, they're routinely translated into English as God or gods. For example, Ifa of the Yoruba, that's the people in Nigeria, Nyasai of the Luo of Kenya, Lesa of the Kondi in Zambia, are widely considered legitimate translations of the English term God or terms gods, and they can be capital or small g. That legitimacy is demonstrated in many ways, like use of African terms to translate God of the English language in African language Bibles. So the Luo language term for God, the one that's primarily used in Kenya is Nyasai. Now, my familiarity with this language has me aware that a person can be considered to be my God. That is, if someone says, in Nyasacha, you are the God of me. That's a human being, maybe a person who blesses me, someone who's somehow helpfully beneficial to me. Maybe they save me in some way. Taking this back to the UK and building on the almost universally accepted assumption that God can be translated between British, English and African languages, then, assuming that the UK government is helpful to the British people, what do we get? Then, government ministers and officers are gods. Now, if the British government has some unified purpose around a single leader, then that leader could legitimately, of course, consider to be God. Now, if God is leading the UK, then the UK is a theocracy. The only way, I suggest, following my argument here, to refuse the UK's status as a theocracy would be to refuse the legitimacy of contemporary translation, that is between African languages and British English. I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it, as they say. Either translation is legitimate, in which case the British Prime Minister is a or the God. Alternatively, if he's not God, then that requires translation to be delegitimized, which would require something like a formal condemnation of use of African Englishes in the UK without translation to make them into British English. Accepting that the UK government is run by gods raises various issues. One is a question of the nature and characteristics of gods. The way the UK government runs will clearly hinge on the characteristics of the gods running it. Pertinent characteristics are many and extremely diverse, including like their tendency to be merciful, their belief or unbelief in an afterlife, maybe their fortitude, their willingness to suffer for the common good, and so on and so on. Questions on these characteristics must of course be engaged theologically. The failure to engage actively with this kind of theology is to make ungrounded assumptions that are not questioned or questionable. I suggest that such assumptions are today all over the British governmental system. That many have not been openly questioned for decades or centuries is demonstrated by the self-imposed apparent secular identity of the British government. Despite the above, or maybe in addition to the above, few would doubt, of course, that the way the British government operates is strongly influenced by the Christian history of the UK and of Europe. People coming from other parts of the world may be more likely to see this clearly than European people. So what the British government does and how it does it is not kind of neutral. There is no neutrality in the absence of absolutes, and because absolutes are not written for everyone just to see, they must be of theological origins. So the British way of governing is theologically guided. In practice, the UK government leans heavily on Yahweh's theological positions. These arise from the UK's and Europe's Christian history. The UK and Western world having become a leader that perhaps maybe even all governments globally nowadays imitate, usually to a greater rather than lesser degree. This means that those governments are building on the same Yahweh's, that is, Christian biblical foundations. Hence, the God of Muslims, or the gods of Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, animist, and other governments, all in a foundational way understand their God to be Yahweh. Now, this kind of discussion ought to make us aware of a great lacuna in today's scholarship, which has long and traditionally been known as theology. It raises a question: who is doing the theology for the UK? There seems to be little by way of government-recognised theological think tanks. If this is correct, then the British government is unquestionably accepting theological assumptions drawn up by prior generations, and is assuming them to be foundational, universal, desirable, even mandatory for the rest of the world to follow, without even thinking how one gets to these presuppositions. All this without clear epistemological foundation. This situation presents us with an amazingly desperate need, given the UK's global influence through its language, its history, its empire, everything, for the gods, as a government in the UK, to engage in very serious Bible study, theology, in order to fill this lacuna.